universe doesn't owe us comfort. If there is no comfort to be had from reality, then that's just tough. I said on radio the other day that I was a cultural Christian, and this seemed to come as a surprise to some people. But
Piers Morgan.
Yes, I mean, I've always been a cultural Christian. And
why do you think so many people want you to take psychedelics? It's you in particular.
One of these days I may just do that. Getting cancelled by people that I sort of think of as my own team is more hurtful. Uniting thread is just a love of the poetry of reality.
Texas, how are we? We well? You just followed me out on stage. I was going to talk for 60 seconds first. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an incredible honor to be sat down next to Mr. Richard Dawkins. We're going to do about 60 minutes of a fireside chat, and then we're going to do about 30 minutes of Q&A. Apparently there were some cards out front you could have filled questions in on. I saw from the Dallas date a question about the adaptive nature of male pattern baldness, so we'll see if anyone's able to beat that this evening. And I'm really looking forward to this. The Genetic Book of the Dead. If we could read that, if we could look at the Genetic Book of the Dead, what would we see? What would it say to us?
It is a book about evolution, and its thesis is that the adaptive fit of animals that you see when you see a camouflaged animal, a beautifully camouflaged animal like, say, a lizard, a desert lizard, which has its environment painted on its back, stones and sand, beautifully painted on the back of this camouflaged animal. Now, that happens to be the animal's own environment, but more important, it's the environment of its ancestors, because it's the ancestral natural selection that has painted the pattern on its back. Now, my thesis is that that attention to detail, which we see on the surface, the skin of the animal, must pervade the entire animal, right the way through every single cell, every biochemical process in the body of the animal, must be honed to exactly the same level of detail perfection, as the camouflaged skin. So the Genetic Book of the Dead is saying that the animal itself is a book, a descriptive book, describing the environments in which the animal's ancestors were naturally selected and which have made the animal the way it is.
If you were to write a book, but it would be sometimes difficult to delete words. I imagine that you would accumulate many paragraphs and previous bits of prose that you maybe didn't need and sort of slowly had to get rid of over time. I think the human spine is probably not a bad example of that, which everybody with a chronic bad back knows and understands.
We are built to walk on all fours until about 5 million years ago. And I think our spine protests at having to stand upright, and that's why so many people suffer from back pain, yes.
In what way are genes immortal? How is it right to say that, even symbolically?
They are immortal in the sense that copies of them go on potentially for actually millions of years. And the natural selection is winnowing those that have what it takes to survive for millions of years. I think I'm booming too much, aren't I? Could we turn the volume down a bit? Okay. Is it okay, is it? So natural selection is a matter of choosing between genes, And the genes that survive are the ones that have the potential to survive in the next generation and the next and the next and the next and the next for millions of years. The ones that are not good at surviving, that means not good at programming bodies that are good at keeping them going, are the ones that disappear. So the world becomes full of genes which are good at building bodies, which are good at surviving and reproducing. So they are all potentially immortal. The ones that are actually immortal are the ones that are good at it. And being good at it means good at programming via the processes of embryology, bodies to survive and reproduce them. Nothing else in the living world is immortal. Only the genes are, and the genes only are in the form of copies. Each individual molecule of DNA decays rather rapidly, but the information goes on and on and on, potentially goes on and on and on, rather like computer information can go on and on and on.
Feels a little bit like the genetic ship of Theseus.
Well,
you can swap out the molecules that made it, but the information and the sense stays the same.
It's not quite the same as the ship of Theseus, I think, because the accuracy of it is pretty well perfect. And it really does go on for forever, or could go on forever. Not literally forever, but for millions of years.
How is it right to say that our genes are a giant colony of symbiotic viruses?
This is the sting in the tail of the book. The selfish gene had the sting in the tail, which was the idea of memes. And this one has this idea that our own genes are a gigantic colony, a symbiotic colony of, well, viruses. The rationale for this is that the only reason why, imagine a parasite, imagine two parasites, viruses, they could be bacteria. One of them gets passed on to the next host via the gametes, via the sperms or eggs of the present one. So you have a bacterium in you, or a virus in you, and its only way of getting into another host is via your sperms or eggs into your children. Now that means that if this bacterium or virus has any effect on the phenotype of the body in which it sits, any influence on the body in which it sits, its interests are going to be identical to those of your own genes. All your own genes have the same interests at heart, so to speak, because they all have the same exit route into the future. They all have the same hope of getting into the next generation via the same exit route, which is your eggs or your sperms. So a bacterium whose exit route is also via eggs or sperms has the same interests at heart. They all have the interests at heart. Now, a virus or a bacterium which does not pass out of the body in the gametes, but instead is, say, sneezed out or coughed out, or comes out in the form of diarrhea, which is then getting into the water supply and is ingested by somebody else. Such a parasite does not have the interests of the whole animal at heart. It does not have the same aims in view, metaphorically speaking. It doesn't care if this host dies. In fact, it probably will die in many cases. So we have this picture of genes as being cooperating with each other to make a body that is good at surviving, good at reproducing, sexually attractive, good at being a parent. All these things are produced by a cooperative of genes, all working together because they have, for the sole reason that they all have the same exit route to the future. So a virus that has the same exit route to the future will also have the same interest at heart, will also, to the extent that it can make the body sexually attractive, a good parent, etc., will be doing the same thing. So the conclusion to the whole argument is that all our own genes can be thought of as a gigantic colony of symbiotic viruses.
Talking about roots out, what was that story about turtles and tortoises being evolutionarily indecisive about whether or not they wanted to be in or out of the water?
It's a remarkable fact that, well, it's not that remarkable, but when our ancestors came out of the water, our fish ancestors came out of the water, quite a lot of them then trooped back again later on in evolutionary time in the form of whales, dugongs, manatees, and turtles. And seals, did I say seals, sea lions, otters, and so on. So you have animals that come out of the water onto the land, and they become thoroughly well adapted to life on land, and they just troop straight back into the water again, and they have to become readapted, retooled to live in water. Well, that's fairly familiar. What's less familiar is that land tortoises came back out again. They are descended from sea turtles. So if you look at the genetic book of the dead for a land tortoise, it could be a desert-dwelling tortoise, anyway, a land tortoise, its original ancestors were in the water in the form of fish. They came out onto the land in the form of some kind of lizardy-like creature. They went back into the water in the form of sea turtles, and then they came right out onto the land again in the form of modern tortoises. So this is, I think, is probably a unique example of a doubling back.
What about crabs? And I've read that crabs seem to be the pinnacle of evolutionary trajectory. Why is it that so many creatures seem to result in becoming crabs?
Well, that is a new one on me.
Have I made this up? Have I been totally psyoped by the internet, or has anybody else read this? Hearing some, yes, it's true, some guy said. Listen, Richard, Austin, Texas are telling us about evolution.
I need further enlightenment on this. I'm aware of a poem by Julian Huxley about crabs walking sideways. It goes something like this. The crab to Cancer Jr. gave advice. Know what you want, my son, and then proceed directly sideways. God has thus decreed progress is lateral. Let that suffice. But I can't, apart from that poem by Julian Huxley, I can't actually understand why anyone would say that crabs are any sort of pinnacle. I do think that the very idea of pinnacles are a bad idea, and some people regard humans as the pinnacle of evolution, and that is not a very good idea either. So let's do away with all pinnacles.
Absolutely. A similar topic, convergent evolution. What are your favorite examples of convergent evolution?
Convergent evolution means those cases where animals come from very different starting points in the tree of life, and then they converge because they have a similar way of life. You may be familiar with Thylacinus, the marsupial dog-like creature, marsupial dog of Australia and Tasmania, recently extinct in Tasmania. Probably extinct, almost certainly extinct, which they might bring it back actually, but it looks very like a dog because it has a similar way of life. I think my favorite convergent example is pill millipedes. There are millipedes that roll up into a ball that behave just like woodlice. So a woodlouse is a crustacean, and you're all familiar with woodlice, but very often what you think is a woodlouse is actually a millipede, which looks exactly the same from on top. You have to turn it over in order to discover that it actually isn't a woodlouse. It has twice as many legs, and it's actually a millipede. So that's one nice example. Thylacinus itself is the Tasmanian wolf, often called Tasmanian tiger for the absurd reason that it's got stripes, otherwise it's nothing like a tiger. That's a very good example. The Australian mammal fauna actually is rather full of convergent examples, because what happened was that when Australia split away from Gondwana, the mammals that were there were all marsupial except for the monotremes, but mostly all marsupial. And so they radiated out. They produced a whole range of creatures: carnivores, herbivores, small herbivores, large herbivores, burrowers, etc., paralleling the animals that we have in the rest of the world, converging on the animals that we have in the rest of the world, but all marsupial. So you could get plenty of nice examples of convergence in the Australian marsupial fauna.
What about eyeballs? How many times did eyeballs independently?
Yes, well, that's very nice too, because the eye has evolved actually many dozens of times independently around the animal kingdom, according to about 9 different optical principles. And so the camera principle, which is how our eyes work, has also been adopted independently and convergently by mollusks. It's mostly highly developed in cephalopod mollusks, in octopuses and squids, where the eye is very, very like ours, but it develops in a totally different way. So it's convergent, but you can see the differences. For example, in the octopus eye, the nerves that supply the retina are sensibly organized. They come backwards away from the retina. Ours are senselessly organized. They're very stupidly organized. The nerves come from in front of the light-sensitive cells, and they have to travel over the surface of the retina, and then they have to dive through the retina in the so-called blind spot. So this is a revealing difference between the vertebrate eye and the mollusk eye being sensibly designed. Actually, the vertebrate eye sees rather better, but this is because of post hoc tinkering, what film people call in post. Post hoc tinkering and in getting the perfection, getting it to really rather a good piece of optical kit, even though it had rather unpromising start.
Yeah, we're doing CGI on our own, on what we see in front of us. Do you ever think about potential traits which could have evolved, did evolve very briefly, and we could have held on to, which would have been super interesting or advantageous, but just happened to not make it through selection pressures, some of the potential branches that were culled?
I have to think about that. Not of it. Do you have any ideas on that?
I just look at all of the different ways that you could roll the dice, and sometimes you're going to roll double 6, and sometimes you're going to roll sort of a 4 and a 3, and it just makes me think how many different chances did we get to be able to develop fingerprints, let's say, just something that came up?
Yes. I think fingerprints are an odd case because they, as you know, they're all unique. And it's hard to imagine what advantage that could have. It's good for detectives, of course, but it seems to be a kind of accident of embryology. It's not obvious why we have 5 fingers. That could be some kind of historical accident. It could be that it might just as well have had 6 or 4. I'm not confident of that. I mean, it might be that 5 is a very good number, but I think it's at least arguable that was a kind of accident which was preserved and preserved and preserved and well, not really totally preserved, because of course horses have just one finger. That's the hoof. And the others have all shrunk. And by the way, that's a lovely example of convergence as well. There was a group of South American herbivores called the light-up terns, which were not very like horses in other respects, but they have limbs almost identical to horses. And again, they lost all the fingers and toes except the middle one. And if you look at the skeleton of some light-up tern limbs, they look identical to horses.
What happens with evolution for animals like humans that exist in a rapidly changing environment such as the modern world? What does it mean to talk about adapting like that?
Adapting in that sense means a bit different from the way in which it's normally used in evolution, but adapting in the sense of adapting to a changing environment like we do. That is something which animals usually go extinct when the environment changes so rapidly. But we are rather good at adapting in that sense. The word adaptation is normally used over an evolutionary timescale. It means actually evolutionary change, genetic change. But you're talking about non-genetic change.
No, I'm talking about genetic change. So what happens from a genetic adaptation perspective to an animal which exists in an environment which from generation to generation is not the same?
Oh, well, what happens is either those individuals who because of genetic variation, genetic mutation, are good at surviving in the changed environment, they're the ones that survive and pass on the genes for surviving.
But given that environment will then change one generation later, any mutation which is advantageous in generation 2 becomes null in generation 3.
Then they go extinct. And most species have gone extinct. I mean, the vast majority of species that have ever existed went extinct. And
I always think about this meme of a guy stood out the front of a Bed Bath & Beyond. He's stood out front, and it's big, sort of broad young dude, broad shoulders, and he's in a shirt and tie. And it says, 5,000 years ago, I would have been a proud warrior. And the point being that there are different skill sets which are useful now in the modern world, which would have been useful previously and are now less so, prioritized in different sorts of ways. Just makes me think about, what is it that if we were to have a little genetic mutation that would be great for the next generation in 2050, but by 2075 that mutation which was useful then is no longer because the environment has changed, and that continues to happen. I wonder if there's some kind of selection for increased flexibility in some form or another.
That's very difficult. I mean, you're almost asking for evolution to have a kind of foresight and sort of look to the next generation, but to the great molecular biologist Sidney Brenner satirized this by imagining a mutation in the Cambrian, which wasn't much good then, but they kept it because it might come in handy in the Cretaceous. You're not thinking of that, but it is. I mean, it's a pretty general rule that evolution has no foresight, and so if a species is going extinct, it goes extinct. It may drive itself extinct, and it cannot, with possibly the unique exception of humans, look ahead. Humans really can look ahead. We have the brain power to look ahead and imagine what the environment might be like in 50 years or 100 years' time. And some people are indeed doing that with respect to climate change, as you know.
How worried are you about John Tooby's idea of the dysgenic effect of increasing mutational load in modern humans now that we have less intense selective pressures being placed on us with advanced healthcare and such like that, the so-called crumbling genome problem?
Well, a lot of people have worried about that from time to time, and I think, although it's probably true that we are keeping genes in the gene pool which would not be kept in the gene pool under natural conditions because of feather bedding, because of modern medicine and so on. I'm all for modern medicine. I like doctors, and and I think it's a price worth paying. I'm not in favor of worrying about that kind of thing. On the other hand, there are certain steps that one could take to limit the spread of obvious dysgenic mutations like hemophilia. But it is possible with in vitro fertilization to what happens in vitro fertilization is that you get the woman to superovulate. So you have say 10 or so eggs fertilized, and then you pick one at random, and re-implant it in the woman. Well, instead of picking it at random, if there was some way, which there is, if there was some way of telling which of those 10 embryos contains the lethal or sublethal gene, then you could pick one that doesn't have the sublethal gene. So there are ways in which you could mitigate the problem that you've just raised, that John Tupy raised.
The subtitle of your book is A Darwinian Reverie. What do you think that Darwin would be most surprised by in evolutionary science over the last 150 years since he passed away?
Well, he would be immediately surprised and delighted by something that happened even in his own lifetime, but he didn't know about, which is Mendelian genetics. Because Darwin was troubled by a critic in his own lifetime who argued that natural selection was impossible because in those days they believed in blending inheritance. They believed that offspring were a kind of mixture, a kind of almost like mixing paint. You mix blue paint and red paint, you get purple. They thought that it worked like that. And if that were true, then the variation in the population would very rapidly decrease to zero, and there'd be nothing for natural selection to work on. And Darwin worried about this. Actually, he shouldn't have worried, because it's manifestly untrue. I mean, as the generations go by, variation does not disappear, and we now know why. I mean, this was discovered as a result of Mendel's work, Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk, the Czech Austrian monk, that genetics is digital. You either have a gene or you don't have it. You pass it on or you don't pass it on. It doesn't blend. Genes don't mix together, don't blend, don't fuse. And so that's the first thing that Darwin would have been delighted by. And then with the Watson and Crick and everything that followed from that after 1953, not only are genes digital, but they're very, very, very digital. I mean, even within a gene, you have digital coding, which is, it's essentially identical to computer coding. It's just quaternary rather than binary. But it is, genetics is a branch of computer science now. And that is wonderful and marvelous. And what it means is that you can, by comparing the DNA of any two animals or plants you like, you can work out how close cousins they are by literally letter by letter by letter by letter comparing them. It's just like taking two manuscripts of a book of the Old Testament and two manuscripts of the book of Jeremiah or something, and comparing them letter for letter for letter for letter. You can do that for any two animals you like a hedgehog and a bandicoot, and work out how close their cousinship is, and in principle how far back their common ancestor lived. In principle, you could actually reconstruct the entire family tree of all of life by doing DNA sequencing. It's a lot more complicated than that, but in principle you could do that. That's something that would absolutely flabbergast Darwin.
Speaking of religion, you spent a good part of your career deconstructing it, only for it to be replaced by the same kind of religious thinking in other areas like identity politics. Was opening up that vacuum with nothing to replace it an error?
No. I'm passionately against nonsense of all kinds. And I do get this accusation quite often that you get rid of Christianity. Well, people sometimes quote, or rather misquote, G.K. Chesterton, who is alleged, I think falsely, to have said, if you get rid of religion, if people stop believing in religion, they'll believe in anything. There may be something in that, but that's not a reason for opposing one kind of nonsense just because it might be replaced by something else. Let us think rationally, scientifically, skeptically, and get rid of all nonsense, not just conventional religion, but other kinds of religion as well.
I don't disagree that nonsense of all kinds should be gotten rid of. But the reality of the human experience is that there was an awful lot of comfort given by those kinds of stories, regardless of the veracity. Much of people's worldviews and beliefs have been pulled apart, but it seems like there is nothing much being offered in its place. So where do you advise people to take their meaning from? We can talk about rationality all that we want, but unfortunately the way that our brains operate from day to day, we're not, despite our best efforts, always as rational as we'd like to be.
Yes, are they not? Well, the first thing to say is that the universe doesn't owe us comfort. If there is no comfort to be had from reality, then that's just tough. But I think actually a life lived in pursuit of rational understanding of the world in which we live, why we are here, why we exist, what life is, what the universe is, what the world is, how old it is. I think that's an immensely satisfying way to spend your brief life, understanding why you exist at all. And so I don't personally buy the need for other kinds of, well, certainly not for superstition of any kind. We are social animals. We do depend upon human comfort from other humans, from love and the consolation of human arms around you is immensely valuable and important. But as far as intellectual comfort is concerned, I get it from science and reason and thinking. And so I don't really feel the need to provide an alternative to church or Bible reading fellowship or something of that sort. But if you feel that need, well, organize it.
Yeah, I think it occurred so quickly. The sort of effectiveness of the new atheist movement happened so fast. I'm just thinking about is bringing people into land gently in some form or another. You know, you rip this worldview out from underneath them. But I agree. You know, the things that I take the most pleasure from are understanding myself and understanding the world around me. You can take an awful lot of sort of solace in that.
Yes. There never was a new atheist movement, you know. I mean, it wasn't organized. It's just a few of us happened to write books at around the same time. And,
there was no grand coordination, is that what you're saying?
None whatever, no.
What do you make of the recent rise of cultural religion? People like Andrew Tate converting to Islam, and Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Russell Brand, big cultural Christianity movement being increasingly vocal about their religious practice.
Yes. Well, I'm skeptical that many of them actually believe it. I can't make out what Jordan Peterson believes. I'm not sure whether anybody else can either. In the case of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whom I love dearly, I thought at first and I said so to her, that she was a political Christian because of her passionate and justified hatred of Islam And I think she possibly first came to a sympathy with Christianity as a sort of bulwark against Islam. To quote Hilaire Belloc, always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse. And there is something to be said, perhaps, if you're right that people do need some kind of religion, then if there's a choice between Islam and Christianity, well, I know which one I would choose. But I think actually Ayaan is a sincere Christian. I got that wrong. I think she really does believe, and I don't understand why. There are people who don't really believe it, but think that Christianity is an important part of the history of our culture, and think that there are people who think that, for example, modern science grew up in Christendom, which it did, and needed Christianity in order to grow up, which I think it didn't. But there are people who take that view. So I think that your question really is rather heterogeneous. I think it applies differently to different people. I think Jordan Peterson, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and various other people, Tom Holland, are all coming at it from different directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting to think about enjoying the fruits but not believing in the tree, or also believing in the tree and sort of taking from the fruits as well.
Yes, well, I said on radio the other day that I was a cultural Christian, and this seemed to come as a surprise to some people. But
Piers Morgan.
Yes, I mean, I've always been a cultural Christian, and so is anybody who's brought up in Church of England schools. You can't help it. You're indoctrinated with it, and you. I mean, I know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the hymn book and the Psalms, and quite enjoy singing some of them and playing some of them. And so, of course, I'm a cultural Christian, but it doesn't mean anything. And to be accused of, what was it you said about enjoying the fruits, but not the
tree.
Not the tree. Yeah. Yes. Well, you can enjoy the music of the church. I mean, never mind about hymns. I mean, the St. John Passion, the St. Matthew Passion, the B minor Mass, the Messiah. These are all wonderful, great music, and you can get involved even in the story behind it. I mean, as a work of fiction. You can enjoy a work of fiction without actually believing the characters ever existed, or believing. So, yes.
Why do you think so many people want you to take psychedelics?
Well, they've probably got a very good reason. They've probably taken them themselves and think it was a great experience.
It's you in particular for some reason.
I don't know about me in particular. One of these days I may just do that.
We did it! Austin, Texas. What a place to do it in. You've also managed over your career to be very successful at embroiling yourself in contentious debates. What have you learned, especially in the modern world, about how to deal with scrutiny and criticism for your ideas, for your stances, for the things that you believe?
I did a couple of readings from my hate mail.
Is there a special mailbox or something?
It was called Love Letters or something like that. It was, and that was rather fun. I mean, I dealt with it by humor, and I didn't need to. I mean, I just simply read them out. There was enough humor there. Things like, I hope you get run over by a church van. And, I mean, that's funny, but I hope you get painful cancer. I think my favorite, though, is I hope you lose your watch and are late for an important appointment.
Very inventive ways to curse you there.
Well, that's one way. Humor is one way. I don't know. Getting cancelled by people that I sort of think of as my own team is more hurtful. So yeah, I don't relish that.
How would you advise people about that, especially given that we've got shifting tribal alliances and people are often parts of certain groups and not others? If you are, like you say, somebody that you respect or admire or is a colleague or is somebody that is a part of your tribe and...
Well, we are terribly tribal and getting more so, and it's really rather sad. I think there's some evidence. Steven Pinker, whom I hugely admire, has in one of his books actual evidence that so many of us base our opinions of perhaps our voting patterns not so much on the actual issues concerned, not so much on thinking about what the pros and cons are of what you're being asked to decide, but whether it's good for your tribe. If you're a Republican, a Democrat, if you're a Tory or Labour in Britain, you automatically, one automatically sides with one's tribe rather than actually thinking out what the issue is. And the right-wing, left-wing continuum, although it actually does seem to work fairly well if you actually look at people's opinions, if you know what they think about, say, abortion, you probably know what they think about a whole lot of other things as well.
I love this idea.
So it does suggest that there is something in the left-right continuum. But on the other hand, why? Because aren't we rather complicated animals, and shouldn't our opinions lie on more than one dimension, 2 or 3 or 4 or 10? Why is it so easy to second guess what somebody thinks about X just because you know what they think about Y?
I know one of your views, and from it I can accurately predict everything else that you believe. Yeah. I wonder as well how much of it is contributed to by a protest vote, not just that you're signaling for your own tribe, but that you're not the other. I think that a huge proportion of people now are not voting for a thing, but voting against another thing.
Well, as it happens, there's quite a lot to vote against at the moment, isn't there? Yes, I think it's a pity if we vote on tribal lines rather than actually think about, and not just vote, but offer opinions based upon tribal loyalties rather than on actually thinking through what it means.
What do you think that Christopher Hitchens would have made of the state of modern political discourse?
Well, Christopher Hitchens is a good example of somebody who couldn't place him on the left-right continuum. He was
very idiosyncratic in that belief.
Yes. So I could have mentioned him as an example of somebody who doesn't fit the left-right continuum. Goodness knows what he would have made of it.
But especially with attacks on free speech, the UK at the moment, you must be thankful that you're at least on tour for a little while longer so that you don't need to return to whatever's happening there at the moment. Well,
I've seen a lot of people commenting on this. I've been a bit out of touch. what is it all about?
It seems that very innocuous online activity is the most sort of egregious transgression at the moment. Guy posted a joke, I think he was in Sunderland or Newcastle, where I'm from, posted a joke on Facebook and was visited by the police.
Oh, I know this one, yes, okay.
Not to tell him that he'd done anything illegal, or to actually warn him about anything, but simply to say that they were watching.
And his joke, I remember it, what his joke was, I was, what is it they say when you're not identified, you're
Assigned.
Assigned. I was assigned mammal at birth, but I identify as fish. Don't misspecies me. That was his joke, which seems to me to be a rather innocuous joke, actually quite a funny one. But as you say, Chris, he was visited by the police, not arrested, but just warned, watch it.
We've got our eyes on you.
Yes.
Yeah. I think usually, no matter the madness that's happening in the UK, we have a nice higher baseline of relative crazy stuff occurring in the US. Makes us feel at least a little bit more sane. I mean, it is true. But we are really giving the US a run for their money at the moment. What do you make of the state of Britain right now, the cultural temperature?
I think that free speech is precious. And I think that attempts to suppress free speech and even making jokes is a terrible thing. We don't have a constitution, we don't have a First Amendment, but I should have thought we just simply would have a sense of common human decency where free speech is concerned.
Isn't it interesting that a lot of people talk about defending the importance of free speech in America, and then when it's derogated or when it's not really that important, there's never a split test to show you what happens if you don't have it. And unfortunately, it seems like the UK is slowly creeping toward being that example of, well, this is what happens if you don't have an amendment in your constitution that does protect free speech. I hope that we're not the sort of contrast therapy for why free speech is a good idea.
Well, I hope so too. I think there's a bit of a backlash against it, though, isn't there? Which yes, okay.
What about the rising concern both against Islam and the rising proportion of Islam back in the UK?
I worry about the anti-science tendency in Islam. My colleague Steve Jones, who teaches genetics in University College London, teaches genetics and evolution to medical students. He has the experience that when he starts to talk about evolution, Islamic students walk out.
They're really going to struggle with the end of your assignments, aren't they?
Yes. So there is, yes. I mean, as a scientist, I think that's very retrograde, and I'm very sorry about that. But it's a problem in this country. It's evangelical Christianity that is the problem, and we don't have so much of that in Britain, but we do have radical Islam.
It is interesting that I think a lot of people in America don't realize that there's no Christian right in the UK. It doesn't really exist in the same sort of way.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yes.
Going back to the genetics point, actually, can you give a little primer on what is true and what isn't true when it comes to epigenetics? Because that feels a little bit to me like the god of the gaps of genetics.
Okay. Epigenetics is a much misused word. It's very fashionable at the moment in a misused sort of way. It actually is just about embryology. If you think about it, every cell in your body except the gametes and the red blood cells, has exactly the same genes, exactly the same diploid genotype. And yet the cells are all different. Liver cells are different from kidney cells, different from muscle cells, different from bone cells, etc. And the reason for that is epigenetics. The reason for that is that different genes are turned on. So we have the entire genome in every cell, but only a minority of those genes are actually switched on in any one type of cell. That's why liver cells are different from muscle cells, etc. So that is epigenetics, the differential switching on or off of genes. Now, just recently, there has been a certain amount of contentious evidence that the switching on or off of genes can get passed on to the next generation. And that superficially sounds a little bit like Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. It's not really, but it sounds a bit like it. And the word epigenetics is now associated in many people's minds with this minority strand of epigenetic changes getting passed on to the next generation. What epigenetics is really all about is the differential switching on of genes within the body, within the embryo, within the developing embryo. So, but it has become very fashionable, and you'll find whole books written about epigenetics. It turns out to mean just the rather slender evidence of epigenetic changes getting passed on to the next generation.
So no ancestral trauma being passed down through the genome?
Yes, I mean, it may be passed on for one generation, but it is not evolutionarily interesting or important because it fades out. It doesn't go on to the next and the next and the next in the way that in answer to your question about what makes genes immortal, mutation does.
How much of that, let's say that you have a mother who is pregnant with a daughter, while that baby is forming inside of the mother, that baby will have all of the eggs that she will carry with her for her entire life. Is there the potential for the cascade to go one generation two within the what would be then grandmother?
I think not in humans. It is true in some insects.
Wow.
That I think there's some insect where my friend Bill Hamilton had this story. Yes, I think you have they have their own grandchildren inside them before they're born.
Wow.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yes.
We're in the city of Joe Rogan. Aliens, Richard. How likely do you think it is that there's life in the observable universe?
Well, the observable universe, I think current estimates say there's something like 10 to the 22 stars, and that's not a small number, and there is increasing evidence that just about every single one of them has planets. So the number of planets in the observable universe is gigantic. And if we are truly alone, if this is the only planet in the entire universe, the observable universe, which has life, if you believe that, then you are committed to the belief that the origin of life on this planet was a bifurcatingly rare event. So rare that it only happened once in many multiples of 10 to the 22 times. Well, I don't think it's that rare. If that were true, if you believe that we are alone in the universe, then you are automatically committed to the view that the origin of life is so improbable on this planet that we're wasting our time trying to work out how it happened, because we are not looking for a plausible theory for how it happened. We're looking for a stupendously implausible theory for how it happened. It has to be a very, very, very implausible event indeed to only happen once. And I don't think it is. I think it's not that implausible. And so I think that there probably is alien life, even if it's so rare that there are only 1 billion examples of aliens in the universe. Only 1 billion. Because the number of possible places where it could have arisen is so large that 1 billion is just a tiny, tiny number compared to that.
That's so cool. I'd never thought of drawing the line between a likelihood of alien life in the observable universe based on all of the stats and a theory of the origin of life, and sort of drawing those two together and basically, making it kind of a very pointless pursuit to try and work it out. Are you going to deconstruct something that's 10 to the 22 unlikely to happen?
Yes. It is worth making a distinction, however, between life in the form of, say, something like bacteria and alien life such as we might be able to talk to or recognize as being sort of like a science fiction alien. It could be that there was a very, very major barrier.
Have you got any sense of what that might be? Prokaryotic to eukaryotic?
Something like that. I mean, the eukaryotic cell, which was formed by the union of prokaryotic cells, bacteria-type cells, that could have been such an improbable event. Actually, it's not that improbable because it happened twice. I mean, because chloroplasts in plants are also...
oh, wow. So we have two different examples of that on our own planet.
Yes.
Okay, that's that theory. Other one.
So it's not that implausible, but it's... I mean, another barrier might be the technological barrier to ever actually encountering aliens. I mean, if the barrier to producing radio technology such that we could pick up signals from aliens, or even that they might come here, which would be even more improbable, it could be that that's the big barrier, and it may be that humans are pretty unique.
I read an interesting take, which is many potential alien life forms would be underwater. And if you are underwater, it's very difficult to do smelting and build up the kind of technology that you would need to be able to do that.
That's true, yes. I mean, another rather sobering thought is that technological societies might blow themselves up before they have a chance to communicate with anybody else.
Still a couple of months until November, so,
yes.
You know. If there were aliens, how likely do you think it would be that they have some form of evolution-like processing going on?
100% likely. There's no other way they could exist. I mean, that's one thing I would stick my neck out and say, that if there is alien life, then it will be Darwinian in some form. And we can speculate a bit further and say, you know, therefore it's got to have some kind of genetics. Will the genetics be digital like ours? I would think almost certainly. Not DNA probably, but something digital. Maybe not one-dimensional like DNA, maybe two-dimensional matrix. But yes, however strange and unearthly it is, the one thing I'm pretty confident of is it will be Darwinian life.
That's cool. What would be the implication of a 2D or a 3D?
Well, that's a nice thought. Our genetics is 1D. It's linear and it's read into sequence. 2D is perfectly conceivable. It would be a matrix of information which would be read as a matrix. 3D is harder because it's hard to get inside a three-dimensional object.
How do you get to the bit in the middle?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'd be surprised if it was three-dimensional. In our form of life, we have one-dimensional genetics and we have three-dimensional executive function. The proteins that the DNA programs with its one-dimensional code is decoded into a one-dimensional amino acid sequence, but then that one-dimensional amino acid sequence coils up into a three-dimensional form. And it's that three-dimensional form which has the important catalytic, enzymatic properties. And that's important. You do need 3D properties of that sort, but the coding of the information, the hereditary information, I think cannot be. So protein could not be the hereditary molecule for that reason.
Given that we're on your final ever live tour, final ever time maybe in Austin, certainly on stage in Austin, although you may be back for other reasons. Looking back on your body of work, can you see a single thread or an underlying dynamic that sort of ties all of your work together?
Well, first of all, I've said this is my final tour. It doesn't mean it's my final visit to Austin.
Hell yeah.
I think I'm on the advisory board of the University of Austin, for example, so maybe... a thread, well, I suppose a uniting thread is just a love of the poetry of reality.
All right, I think it is time for us to answer some questions. Thank you. Expecting, that's a lot of questions. Do I just choose these? I just get to filter through them? As many as I want. Is this in order? Is this the first one I want to go with?
You can go any order you like, I think.
Oh, okay. I'm looking for the male pattern baldness one again.
I have no answer to that, so don't.
Okay. Ooh, this is great. Congratulations, whoever asked this. What area of evolution do you find the most interesting but least explored?
Oh, gosh. Well, I suppose human evolution is extremely interesting, but it's very much explored, so that doesn't count. I'll have to pass on the second part of that, I think.
Totally fine. I've got bangers here, don't you worry. I have an unlimited list of bangers. Can you discuss how much good parenting actually matters in relation to genetic influences?
Well, there is some rather disquieting evidence that parental influence is rather less than one might wish. Some evidence that the influence of one's peers, children's peers, is more important than the influence of parents. I've never really believed that, but that's what the psychological.
Be careful who your children are friends with.
Sorry?
Be careful who your children are friends with.
Well, yes. I suppose we have to believe it because that's what psychologists tell us. But I mean, I do think also genes are immensely important and probably underrated by social scientists.
I accept that life is finite, and that's a beautiful thing. How do I combat the panic of wasting a day when we have so few?
Oh gosh. Well, we all waste days, don't we? We're all lazy and don't fill our days the way perhaps we should if it were our last day. I have no particular wisdom to offer on that. I mean, I think I'm astonished at how rapidly my life has gone by. I mean, I'm 83. I feel about 30. If it were not for seeing a shelf full of the books that I've written, I would wonder what the hell I was doing.
This is the archaeological record of Richard Dawkins. Yes. According to population scientists, there is going to be a massive population decrease around the year 2100. What implications does this have on the human genotype and phenotype?
Oh dear.
Austin, Texas, really turning it up this evening.
Yes. Well, I didn't know about that forecast, and it's interesting because it goes right against the sort of dire warnings of overpopulation that.
Unfortunately, I think it's true.
Yes.
I think it seems very accurate.
What's it due to?
So we've got below replacement birth rates pretty much everywhere, except some sub-Saharan Africa. I think for every 100 South Koreans, there will be 4 great-grandchildren at the moment. That's the current state of birth rates. If you just run, and demography is destiny, right? You can't make any more 1-year-olds. You can only make 0-year-olds.
This is entirely new to me, and I will look it up.
There we are.
Yeah.
If we could magically erase everyone's belief in religious myth in 2024 without losing our existing knowledge of science, would religion be created again?
That's a fascinating question. Well, I suppose since religions have been created within living memory, we sort of know the answer to that in a way. Well, there is the religions of the Pacific Islands, which the religion of John Frum, the worship of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and the cargo cults. These are examples of religions that are manufactured and invented. The Mormonism was invented as recently as the 19th century. So I suppose there might be some reason to think that humans just fall for these kind of things. I don't. It's a rather depressing thought, isn't it?
Okay, left turn. What would be the evolutionary advantage of homosexuality?
Well, this is a difficult one, and there's been a lot of people thinking about it. It's not a problem unless there is genetic contribution to the variance, which there is. So you can measure the genetic contribution to variance by various ways, such as twin studies, where you compare identical twins, monozygotic twins, with fraternal twins. And most things turn out to have a reasonably high heritability, and sexual orientation is among them. So there is a problem. There are various hypotheses. And the frequency of, for example, male homosexuality is such that it does seem to need some kind of an explanation. You can't just write it off. One theory is the worker bee theory, that although a homosexual male, for example, might not have children himself, he might be a benevolent uncle to his nephews and nieces, and in some situations might pass on his genes thereby. Then there's the theory of how can I put this? In our wild ancestors, when dominant males were away, for example, out hunting, they might have wished to leave the women in the charge of males that could be trusted. And if homosexuals were actually bisexual, at least in part, then that there might have been a minority strand of genes passing down the generations through, from the point of view of the dominant males, illicit matings when their backs were turned. We know that in many species of mammals where There are dominant males that sequester females, for example, seals and sea lions. There are lots of males around who, in the ordinary course of events, don't get to mate. And they're called sneaky maters, because they will, when the dominant male isn't looking, they will occasionally sneak a mating with a female. And I suppose that ostentatious homosexuality might have lulled the suspicions of dominant males in our wild ancestors. That's another of the theories. My own preferred idea is that we may be asking the wrong question. When you talk about the genetic effect on a phenotype, it is very often dependent on the environment. And suppose that there is, whatever the genes are that influence homosexuality now, didn't have that effect in our wild ancestors in the in the time when most of our natural selection was going on. Suppose, for example, this is just a very, very hypothetical example, the difference between bottle feeding and breastfeeding of babies. Suppose that the gene only manifests itself in people who were bottle-fed as babies. And that's just one possible example of the kind of environmental thing I'm talking about. So in the days before bottles were invented, that gene would not have manifested itself as the homosexual phenotype that it does today. So something changed in the environment, which meant that a gene which had a totally different effect in our wild ancestors had the effect of producing a homosexual phenotype in the present environment. That's a particular example of a general case where the effect of a gene is not an absolute effect, but is dependent upon the environment in which the individual is brought up.
You'll be familiar with the birth order effect.
Yes.
That for every older male that a mother has, it is more likely for subsequent males to be gay. This recently was shown to be true for lesbians as well.
Uh-huh.
So for each male that is born, and this includes miscarriages and ones that aren't carried to full term, and it's true for homosexuality in women also, which I thought was fascinating.
That's a significant effect, statistically significant effect, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. There's a psychologist called, I think, Sulloway, who shows, well, a historian actually, I think, a psychologist. He claims that younger sons are more likely to be rebellious and inventive than older.
Maybe to try and leapfrog the status hierarchy of the elder son.
Something like that. Something
fascinating.
Like that. Yes.
So interesting. Could you explain wolf to dog evolution? I have heard conflicting things from different biologists.
Well, I'm not aware of conflict. Conrad Lawrence wrote a book called Man Meets Dog, which wrongly said that some domestic dogs are descended from jackals and others from wolves, but that's just wrong. I mean, they're all descended from wolves. And I don't think well, the theory that I know, and seems plausible enough to me, is that wolves hung about human habitations and were the ones that were more inclined to be tolerant of humans and less inclined to be frightened of humans were the ones who prospered by, in the first place, feeding from rubbish dumps, from middens, and scraps of human food that were thrown away. And so that selected for a kind of tameness among wolves, which gradually was increased and then possibly led to wolf cubs being adopted perhaps by children as pets. It is an interesting fact which has been emphasized by a man called, I think, Coppinger, who says that when dogs go feral, when they, having been domesticated, then leave humans and go back to being wild, go feral, they don't go back to being wolves. What they become is something more like dingoes, or what he calls village dogs. And this suggests to him that although ultimately domestic dogs come from wolves, they went through a very long stage of being more like dingoes, and so that's what they revert to when they go feral. But I'm not aware of the controversy which your questioner has.
Neither am I, but I do know that we had wolves and now we've got cockapoos, and that does seem like a...
Well, it is a dramatic example of how fast evolution can go when it's when it's domestic selection. It's a kind of lesson for how quick selection can operate.
I even saw a photo of a husky next to a wolf yesterday, and it is insane. It's so much bigger, these two animals, even the one we look at and think, oh, it's kind of like a wolf. That's like what a wolf is, and then you see it next to a wolf and it's this big elephant thing behind it.
Yes.
If the gods existed, which would you most like to sit down with and ask why?
There's so many gods to choose from, aren't there? Zeus, Thor, I don't know. It's not my kind of question. I suppose Jesus counts as a god, I suppose. I would quite like to talk to Jesus, I must say. Find out the truth.
Are there any theories that you used to confidently espouse that you've since walked back from and or regretted?
I ridiculed a theory which is now, I think, probably true, and I was wrong to do so, and I've said so. That's the handicap theory of Amos Zahavi, the Israeli zoologist. The handicap theory of animal communication, for example, in sexual selection, the idea that in order to validate a gesture or a piece of animal communication, like advertising for a mate or attempting to intimidate a rival, the signal has to be costly in order to carry conviction. Zahavi originally put this forward with respect to sexual selection, for example, the peacock's tail, which manifestly is a handicap. The male peacock has this gigantic fan, which is beautiful and is clearly designed as an advertisement, and is an obvious handicap, making it very difficult to fly, very vulnerable to predation, and so on. And in the first edition of The Selfish Gene, I was all for saying, yes, it is a handicap, but in spite of being a handicap, sexual selection favors it because females go for it. And Zahavi had the idea that, yes, it's a handicap, and the reason females go for it is precisely that it is a handicap. Only those males who can afford the costly burden of this gigantic, ridiculously huge tail, that is a badge of their quality as males, and females choose them precisely because they have survived in spite of having this handicap. I ridiculed this theory in the first edition of The Selfish Gene, along with just about everybody else. And then rather later, Alan Graffen, who was my own research pupil and is very mathematical, produced a very convincing mathematical model to show that the handicap principle does actually work. And so I had to backtrack and climb down and apologize to Amat Zahavi, who said, no, you don't understand, because he doesn't like anybody to agree with him.
Oh, God. Ungracious even in victory. Yeah. How can the USA reverse its distrust of science? Todd.
I don't know about the USA. I hesitate to say anything about that here. But how can any country reverse its distrust of science? I don't understand why anybody would mistrust science. I mean, science is the way to understand the real world. And bad science, of course, exists. And so obviously you should mistrust bad science. There are people who, scientists, a few of them even cheat. But even those who don't cheat sometimes don't do very well. But methods are in place. Science has methods in place to verify, repeat, and if something is genuinely true, science will find it. And the body of knowledge that science has built up over the last few centuries is very solid and is continuing. Of course, there are mistakes that are made, and they are corrected. There are methods of correcting are in place, and so there is really absolutely no excuse for anybody not to trust the scientific method. They can mistrust individual scientific findings, if you like, but the scientific method as a whole has proved itself, and it works. And this is why we have rockets that can go to the moon. This is why we have planes that don't fall out of the sky all the time. Science works, and people who purport to mistrust it use it every day of their lives. They use it when they pull out their iPhone and look something up on the internet. They're using science.
I think trust the science became a mocking meme throughout much of COVID. Many of the institutions people used to put their faith in didn't exactly shower themselves in glory. And I think that, even if the method is still valid, the perception is very critical at the moment.
Well, COVID was a special case where there was this sudden crisis, and politicians had to give advice, or more than advice, actual sort of dictatorial advice, which in some cases may have been wrong. And when you have a crisis that happens all of a sudden like that, and you're not prepared for it, you tend to get things wrong.
Yeah, the blast radius of that appears to have encompassed more than just pandemic. It's sort of encompassed lots of other stuff as well.
Yes.
Hello, Richard. Do you think the United States is progressing or going backward in terms of secularism and religious belief?
Well, it's going the right direction if you believe the polls. I mean, there's poll evidence that the number of people who disavow any particular religion and say they have no religion is increasing, and I think is something like 25% now, which is a very good figure and going in the right direction.
You're going to have to explain a little bit of this one to me. I am an agnostic, brackets, level 6. That feels like a World of Warcraft type thing.
Okay, I do take the allusion because it's one of my own. in the God Delusion, I had a 7-point scale where I think 7 was, I forget which way around it went. Yes, 7 was totally convinced there is no God. 1 was totally convinced that there is. And I felt that it was unreasonable to be absolutely, totally convinced of something that you can't demonstrate.
So you were 6?
So I said I was a 6, and then I
Kindred
said
spirits.
maybe a 6.9.
Careful with that number. Yeah. However, I'm an agnostic level 6. However, I'm unable to provide solace in times of great grief. A friend lost his 10-year-old son. He finds solace in the religious idea of heaven and reuniting later. Does atheism have an alternative?
I would not attempt to disabuse a bereaved person who got comfort from that. I think it would be inhumane to do so. I don't get comfort from the thought of heaven myself. I think the idea of eternity is rather frightening, and I think I'd rather spend eternity under a general anesthetic than actually experiencing it. But as I said, I would not. If somebody was on their deathbed and believed in heaven, I wouldn't go and sort of try to tell them it's all a lot of rot.
Steam in with a flame-wielding atheist sword and just cut down their whole worldview. No, let's...
They might be frightened of hell, of course.
Depends how good the person... I guess you could make a judgment on that. You would be the judgment. Interesting one. As humans evolve, how do you envision sex changing? I don't know if that means male-female or the act of procreation. You can pick.
I don't think it'll change. Why would it change? I mean, I don't quite see why you would expect it to change.
Moving on.
Okay.
Do you think veganism is a more ethical choice?
Probably yes. And I aspire to it, but haven't yet managed it.
Aspiring vegan. That could be a new bio. Richard Dawkins, best-selling author, aspiring vegan.
I find it hard to do without cheese and no bacon, no problem. Cheese and eggs, I think.
There's a friend of mine, Alex, who's hosting a conversation in LA, went vegan, talked about it an awful lot on the internet, just couldn't make it work. So I do think you need to be careful about how much you proselytize about going vegan. Because if you need to reverse
I don't proselytize for that reason.
Yeah. But if you need to reverse it like those turtles that couldn't decide whether or not they wanted to be in or out of the water, what a nightmare. The common expression is, religion wasn't reasoned in, it can't be reasoned out. Have you successfully reasoned out religion from many people? Bill Stockton.
I get encouraging letters from people who've read The God Delusion and Outgrowing God. I think that it looks to me as though you can be reasoned out of it, and it would be a sad thing if you couldn't, because the ability to reason is one of the glories of the human species, and we are progressing. We have progressed a long way over the centuries. Let's just keep it up.
Heck yeah. All right, where's my photographer? Come to me, please. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Richard Dawkins' final time on stage in Austin, Texas. Please give me a round of applause.
Okay?
Just you, Richard. You're the star of the show. One final time, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. There it is. How beautiful. Thank you so much all for coming out.